Now, as we've been talking about, what's getting all the headlines today is this HBO tape of Durst's apparent confession. He said in it, quote, "I killed them all." Now, his attorney, Chip Lewis, spoke earlier to 48 Hours via Skype about that very tape.
It's not an open and shut case here. For 15 years, LAPD has done everything they could with a lot of hard work, a lot of good detectives and fine prosecutors, and they did not pull the trigger on this. There's still the same problems they had before that they will have now. And their decision to take these words that a elderly gentleman who is relieving himself in a bathroom is muttering under his breath is their prerogative. And I don't fault LAPD or the fine prosecutors at all. I have huge issues with what Drecky's done here. I think it insults journalists like you and others that their rectitude and integrity would never, ever allow them to stoop to the level of going out of their way to befriend, to cajole, to lie to a man to get him to say things that were incriminating.
Joining us now through Skype is Emeritus Professor of Law, Harvard Law School, Alan Dershowitz. Thanks for being here. Do you think this HBO footage could possibly be admissible as evidence against Durst, in your legal opinion?
Well, it's a hard question. I mean, it really sounds like something out of a Shakespearean soliloquy. In real life, people don't talk to themselves and say, I killed them all. Obviously, Hamlet talked to himself and said to be or not to be. The real question is twofold. Number one, will it be excluded because he had an expectation of privacy in the bathroom when he was there and may not have been warned that he was wearing something that recorded? On the other hand, they may say, look, he's been interviewed before. He could have turned off the microphone. He made a decision to keep it on. So that's going to be a hard question. The second question is whether it constitutes an admission or just simply him saying, yeah, I killed them all. That's what they're saying about me. It can easily be interpreted as ambiguous, but I think it'll be the central point at any prosecution, because if the court allows it in, and if the prosecutor can persuade the jury that it's a real admission, then the jury will see all the other circumstantial evidence through the prism of an admission. If it's kept out, on the other hand, the case is a very circumstantial case. So these very good lawyers, and he has very good lawyers, should be focusing very heavily on the legal issue and on how to try to exclude that evidence and keep it from the jury. Remember, the jurors will not know about Jinx. They will not know about the HBO. Any juror who is seeing the HBO program will automatically be struck. So we're getting jurors who will hear this admission for the first time on the witness stand if it's allowed to come in.
And how hard does that video make jury selection if that's the case?
No, not so difficult. It's not like the Boston Marathon case where everybody in Boston knows about the case. HBO has a select audience. The vast majority of potential jurors will not have seen it, and the vast majority will never have heard of it, will not have read it in the newspaper. It will be relatively easy to get 12 jurors for whom that statement will come for the first time. They will never have heard it before.
And there's such a Shakespearean, as you said, history here. There's so many complexities to this case. What kind of challenges does the defense face?
Well, first of all, he's lucky. He has some of the best defense attorneys in the United States on his side. One of them already got him an acquittal in a previous case. So he knows the defendant, he knows the case very well, and he's an absolutely first-rate lawyer. There are challenges, but I think there are greater challenges for the prosecution. The prosecution has to overcome the barrier of proof beyond a reasonable doubt in a case that's highly circumstantial, in a case that has failed once before, in a case with a lot of holes and a lot of uncertainty. So this is a challenge for both sides, but prosecution has the burden of proof, so the challenge is probably greater for them.
Now, what about past cases like Durst's wife disappearance from so many years ago? Can that play a role here, do you think?
Well, of course, they're going to be looking for the body. Now, if he had admitted, obviously, doing that and where the body was buried, if they can find the body, obviously that will be tremendously advantageous. In general, evidence of a prior crime can't come in unless you can show a pattern. And it doesn't seem like there's enough here to show a pattern. So I suspect, again, the jurors will know far less than we all know. The jurors will not know about the HBO special. They probably will not know about the missing wife whose body has not been found. They probably won't know about the other case that he's been acquitted in. For them, this will just be the presentation of evidence that's admissible that the prosecution can present to the jury in this case. That's why it's going to be so difficult for them.
And one piece of evidence in this case is the fact that he may have been already on the lam. He was checked into a hotel under an assumed name. Do you think that's going to play a role?
Well, prosecution will try to admit evidence of flight. It's going to be very hard because there's no real evidence that he was trying to escape or get out of the country. It's only speculation, unless the FBI has some information that we're not aware of. In general, that kind of evidence doesn't play much of a role in the jury's thinking because, after all, even if he's suspected of a crime of which he's innocent, you might imagine somebody trying to hide or get away. And he was fairly well in plain sight. I mean, he was in New Orleans at a hotel, checked in obviously on a different name, but he's used different names in the past. And, this is not a man who gets A+ in current mental health. So I think a lot of his conduct can be explained by his, to say it very mildly, eccentricities. So again, this could be a hard case for the prosecution.
Speaking of mental health and eccentricities, Durst has had so much bizarre behavior in the past. Is it possible that an insanity plea could come into play?
Unlikely an insanity plea, but I think that his mental health will come into play on the admissibility and on the weight to be given to the alleged confession, because obviously the defense will argue this is a man who hallucinates, this is a man who has mental problems. Sure, he may have gone to the bathroom and mumbled these words, but you shouldn't take these words seriously. It might be a little like the Eitan Potts case that is now in New York, where a guy allegedly confessed to a crime and, maybe he didn't do it. So we have all of these elements that will come into play at a trial, if there is a trial. And it now looks like there will be a trial. Of course, the other thing you have to take a lesson from this is if you've done something, don't go on television and talk about it. I had a case many years ago where my client was accused of killing his wife, who was terminally ill, and he was fine until he wrote a book about it. And then once he wrote a book about it, he got prosecuted. He was acquitted. We won the case. But nonetheless, going on television and having great TV producers and investigative reporters do a better job than prosecutors have done is not a prescription for safety. So the advice is don't do that in the future. And I'm sure his lawyers have told him that.
Right. Wanting attention can be damning. There is something to be made of the timing of this arrest. Obviously, authorities arrested him right before this final episode of the HBO documentary, so they thought possibly that he may have been a flight risk. But one would infer that they have more evidence than that, or they wouldn't have been able to make this arrest. Would you think that?
No. I think they had clearly enough evidence for an arrest. Even just the statement alone is enough evidence for an arrest. The threshold for an arrest is very, very low, probable cause. And clearly they arrested him because he was in New Orleans, which is a port city, a city that has access to airports. He was under an assumed name. They had this statement. So there's enough for an arrest. I also think that in the end, New Orleans will not keep him there on a minor gun charge when Los Angeles wants to try him for a major first-degree murder charge. So I think this may delay it, but in the end, sensible minds will prevail, and he'll be taken to the place where he is charged with a major crime, not the minor crime.
Now, the threshold for arrest is low, but the threshold for guilt is actually quite high. And you said that you think attorneys are going to really have a hard time proving this case, right?
I do. I think it's going to be a circumstantial case. It will all depend on the admissibility of this statement. If the statement is admissible, then the jury will see all the circumstantial evidence through the prism of what they believe is a confession of guilt. If the evidence is not admissible, or it can be contradicted by his very excellent lawyers, then they're going to have to look at the circumstantial evidence independently and in isolation, and they may very well have a reasonable doubt about his guilt. So everything, I think, is going to turn on the admissibility and weight given by the jury to these statements made in the bathroom in his soliloquy.
It's so great to hear your expert legal opinion. Alan Dershowitz, Professor Emeritus at Law at Harvard, thanks so much for joining us here on CBSN.
Thank you.